This is Transfiguration Sunday. It's kind of the midway point between the baptism of Jesus and Easter Sunday. So it kind of brackets Epiphany, but it also brackets Lent and Holy Week. And every time I start to preach on Matthew, I kind of feel like I've got to take a cue from Charles Dickens. When he wrote The Christmas Carol, the very first thing he said is, Marley, it was dead to begin with. Of this, there can be no doubt. Well, taking that same language structure and putting it on Matthew, Jesus was Hebrew to begin with. Of that can be no doubt. For Matthew, Jesus was very much the new Moses. And we see that today in the scripture when Jesus' face lights up while he's on the mountain, just like Moses did. In fact, this is the only gospel that tells about the Transfiguration where Jesus' face lighting like the sun is even mentioned. It is an intention to make sure the people who listen to this understood Jesus as the new Moses. So getting back a little bit to the symbolism we are going to. Jesus goes up the mountain, which is a very typical thing to do in the Middle East in this period of time. In fact, if you look at the temples all around the Middle East, doesn't matter what tradition, if we're looking Persians, Greeks, Romans, Hebrews, they're all built on mountaintops. And that is not because of defensive positions, because these are not turrets. These are not castles. These are not battle site places. They're built on hills because the people of the Mediterranean believed to come to God, you had to be some effort. So when Moses goes up into the mountains, when Jesus goes up into the mountains, when Elijah is up in the mountains, they are de facto closer to God, the spirits of the sky, but they also had to put the effort into going. So Jesus takes some of his closest, the ones who've been with him right from the beginning, up the mountaintop. And while he is there, he is transfigured. Now, transfiguration is one of our words. It's a very Christian word, and it's not something we're going to hear other places. But trans is something that we as culture are getting to be quite familiar with, especially those of us who identify as cis. And as a friend of mine years ago who was studying biochemistry said, these terms actually come out of biochemistry. Trans is change, cis is the same. So trans is to journey, to change from one to another. We have in Canada the Trans Canada. It crosses us from one end of the country to the other. Transgender, transsexual, transvestite. Some of these words aren't used anymore, but it's the same concept of change as we watch people move from one experience to the next and how we can support that. So we have Jesus in a trans moment, changing from one essence into a more honest essence, because that's what trans folk are trying to remind us. They're not changing into something they choose, they're changing into their authentic selves. Just like Jesus was transforming into his authentic self in Transfiguration, when the robes got whiter and the face lit up like a sunshine. And then we have the disciples responding to this. Now, just before this story, we have Jesus asking these same folks, who do you say I am? And Peter answering, of course, you're the Messiah, which had a very political, very specific tone for the early Hebrew folks. They had a vision of what the Messiah was going to be. And part of that was getting rid of the Romans. So when Jesus predicts his death for the first time, Peter says, no, you can't mean that. And Jesus says, get behind me, temptation. I cannot deal with this. So that comes right before we get this story of Transfiguration. So Jesus is giving them another chance, and they come up into the mountains, and then as soon as Jesus is light and shining, Moses and Elijah appear. Now, for any Hebrew person, for any Jewish person today, Moses and Elijah are the cornerstone characters of the tradition. Moses represented the law, Elijah represented the prophets, the two basic foundational places where they found the theology of their faith, but also where they encountered God. So here we have Moses and Jesus and Elijah. And in a line that I absolutely adore, they're just chatting, they're just talking. No big deal, no one-uppersonship, no trying to get the attention of anybody around them. They're just talking very casually. And Peter breaks into that because Peter is consistently through all of the Gospels the one who speaks without thinking. And he says, oh, This is amazing. Let's build you temples. Let's build you tents for everybody so you can stay here. Now, a lot of ink has been spilled about why Peter would want to do that. A lot of people kind of land on the fact that he wanted this experience to continue. And I'm sure he did. Anything revelatory like that, anything that the Christian word is theophany, anything absolutely and spiritually amazing like that, we want to maintain, we want to hold on to, we want to live in that moment. Even though in our sober second thought we realize those moments are fleeting by nature. We cannot live in those moments. We just have to visit. And this is the experience with Jesus. He doesn't stay all white robe and glowing face. That's just a moment. He continues on as who he is. And the fear and the trembling, the apostles fall down when this voice comes and says, "This is my son, the beloved. Follow him." The same language used at baptism. So there we get our bookends of epiphany. Epiphany meaning enlightenment and finding new wisdom and finding something to celebrate and learn. So we have those bookends of epiphany to transfiguration, where God is again saying, this is the guy. These others, they're great, but this is the one that you are now to follow. Because Jesus said, we just looked at the Temple of the Mount a few weeks ago, where he said, I did not come to change anything, not one iota of the Bible. I am here to fulfill the laws of Moses and the prophets of Isaiah and the rest of the teachings around that. So it makes sense that the other two would disappear from sight because it's not about them. There's almost like a handing of the torch that is going on, an acknowledgement for these people who are meant to be the witnesses that Moses and Elijah were there, but Jesus is the one now who is picking up the responsibility and continuing forward, that there's something special about Jesus. And the glowing is what gives us away. Now, people often ask me how I can have faith. And one of the things they particularly ask me, as someone who has buried a lot of people in my family, how can you believe in an afterlife? For me, it's very, very simple. And it goes back 30 years ago when a great aunt of mine was dying. Her sister was there, my mother, my sister was there. We were all there, but it was my hand that my aunt held on to. And I watched my grandmother, her sister, look at her and watch her, and I thought, no, she needs to be holding her sister's hand in the last moment. So I took my great aunt's hand and I put it in my grandmother's. And very slowly my aunt pulled that hand back and reached for mine again. I was the one she wanted to spend these final moments with. And she turned her head to me. And as I watched her take her raspy last breaths, her face lit up and her eyes began to almost glow. The blue was so bright and vibrant. She did not last very many breaths longer, and she was gone. But she gave me that vision of light, that vision of something on the other side that has allowed me this whole time to be absolutely 100% convinced there is life beyond death, just as Christ has promised. Now, this lighting up, this glow, different people through history have had that experience. It's not just something Jesus has had. This transfiguration, this transformation is something available to all of us. Now, maybe not as grand and theatrical as what happened 2,000 years ago on that hill, but each of us has the ability to be available to see that light, to see that change, to be that transformation. And it is a blink of an eye and it is gone. But we're given that opportunity to see that there is more, and it is light, and it is beautiful, and it's where we want to go. It's where we want to be. It's what we want to see and experience. And Peter naturally saying, let's build tents to keep you all here. It's a natural inclination for a guy who just really talks without thinking. And their fear when they fell down and heard God's voice. And then they're being raised. That's actually the Greek word used, raised like raised from the dead. When Jesus touches them, Jesus raises them up and says, don't be afraid. It's all good. And then as they walk down the hill, Jesus says, don't tell anybody until the Son of Man has come back. Now, this is our Transfiguration Easter bookmarks, where we are looking at the journey of Lent as the next part of the experience. See, the thing with Transfiguration is it sets us up to experience what Lent can be. Lent is not a time of just superficially giving up chocolate or Coke or coffee or thinking that's all there is to it. Lent is a time for us to take a deep dive into ourselves to find out what that thing is this year, because we can't focus on everything. But what is that thing this year that we want to focus on, that we want to work on, that we want to understand more? Do we want to pray more? Do we want to read more? Do we want to act more? All of these are the pillars of Lent. And Transfiguration sets us up because through this story, we have a glimpse of the light and the availability of that light as we change, as we become something more authentic in our faith, just as Jesus for a split second became something transparent and authentic to the apostles that were there that day. On the way down the hill, and this gets back to the point where we're never ever out of Hebrew context. We don't have this as part of our reading today, but the apostles go on and say, how can we possibly know that you are the new Messiah or the new Moses if we haven't had the new Elijah? Because the laws of Moses say Elijah's going to come back first. And Jesus says, of course, Elijah's already come back. Came back in the person of John the Baptist to point the way. Matthew has created a world that represents the giving of the commandments and the sharing of the prophecies and the teachings. That's all a prophet was, as a teacher of God in the historic community of the Hebrew people. And now, through an act of transformation, the apostles have gotten a glimpse that there is more, that there is something more. And as they start that journey to Jerusalem, as we start that journey to Jerusalem, we need to hold on to that something more. We have to embrace it and look at it and find out what it is that is transformed in us so we can continue our faith. The apostles might not have told anybody until after the resurrection on Easter Sunday, but it doesn't mean it didn't stay with them, and it doesn't mean they didn't natter with their friends, and it doesn't mean that they didn't look at things through a new light. We are transfigured. We are changed through this story. We have to identify what that is and continue on the journey knowing that with the glimpse of absolute ecstatic joy in light that we have seen, there is far more to the story. It's not all going to be doom and gloom. At the end, it's going to be fabulous.